Make one traffic stop. I'm standing there at the window. You know what a microburst is?
Yep.
It dumped right on my
Right on your
head,
head.
like a bucket of water, and then it was done. Only on me.
I was at a football game where that happened. I'm in a stadium.
I mean,
Right,
poured.
no. I'm in the stadium. It was in the city. I remember it was in North Park College. And I'm in the stadium, in the stands, and all of a sudden this microburst comes over. There's a little patch of us we get dumped on.
I mean,
Completely
not drops.
No, dumped.
Like
Literally dumped.
truly.
Yep. I've had that.
I mean, I was drenched. Like you
Uh-huh.
dumped a bucket of water over my head in 1 second. And the person that I pulled over was so happy because they weren't getting a ticket. I
I've
was
had
like,
that happen.
I need to go, and you are free to go.
As I said, give it 10 minutes, the weather will change in Chicago. It just does. It just happens that way.
I have 3 shovels ready for my
You
children.
know,
Hey, Stuart. Hey, Maxine. Hey, Stuart.
hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Boker
Good morning.
Tov,
Good evening.
Lila Tov, in
Oh.
between Tov.
Good to hear your voice.
Same here.
Good to hear your voices.
Yes.
Hi, Rabbi.
Hi,
We miss
Maxine.
you.
We miss you. I miss you too. How is your babysitting?
Tell her, tell him,
Oh,
we're
We had-
frozen already.
oh no, that
There
was
you are.
quick.
You were frozen for a second. I hear you. Do you hear me?
Yeah,
Okay, I did hear you. Now you're muted. Now you got muted somehow. You just got muted. I think I can unmute you, can I? Or maybe not. If you muted you, I don't know. I can only, you have to unmute
done.
you. So how do you mute it over there? Bum, 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 bum. Still muted. Still muted. Still muted. Bum, 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 bum.
By the way, that one individual who sent me that email.
Yeah.
He goes, the rabbi never called. What do you want me to do?
Which, What?
Remember that email I sent to you? That gentleman who wants the bean bomb and that other thing?
wait, what was it?
I looked through emails from last week. When did I send that to you? Where he was
Hey,
asking-
Doris.
Where he was asking the question about some songs, whether or not they were Yiddish or Hebrew.
So I did not, I think I did look at that email and I
Right.
didn't understand what
Here,
was he trying to
I'll
figure
try
out.
to-
Yeah. Okay.
He wants your assistance.
Hey, Doris.
Oh, how are you?
Excellent. How are you?
Happy Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah. How are you?
Good.
Good. Very good. So there were some other people on, Maxine and Stuart. And,
They're lost.
but then they were having technical issues. So I'm gonna give it another minute or two and then we'll get started.
Okay.
Let's see, what did I do?
My conversion program
Here we
is
go.
looking for Jewish teachers to teach online once a week.
How do you like that?
Are you interested?
I don't know.
On Wednesday of last week, I
Yeah.
sent this to you.
When I remember, and now I remember it sort of. So you
Rabbi
sent it
Karsh,
again?
you want me
Yeah,
to
so
send-
read it to me.
Rabbi Karsh, have a relationship in need of some identifying some songs and maybe some
Oh, with
transliteration.
AY. You said
Right,
something about
maybe
AY.
your
right?
AY want to do it.
Right. Okay, so what did I say about that? Oh, yes, so,
If you want AY to look at it, that's fine.
so just resend it.
I'll
and
resend it when I'm.
Okay,
I'll
resend.
resend it. By the way, were you at Lincolnwood Town Center over? the
No,
weekend?
AY was.
AY was.
AY saying that.
Because one of my clients goes, there's a car shoe is at the Lincolnwood Town Center. I'll find out.
That was AY. He's been doing it every year. I don't know what happened. I don't think he did during COVID, but other than that, he's been doing it every year for quite a few years. And one year, I have video of it somewhere. one year he was singing and there was a Santa like across the way,
Okay,
and the Santa started dancing to his,
music?
clearly Jewish, because he was dancing like in, that like sort of traditional Jewish way. And at one point AY goes, "Go Santa." It's gonna come up because last year it came up as a Facebook memory because I posted the video. So sort of humorous. Okay. So yeah, want to talk about Hanukkah, since this is Hanukkah. Happy Hanukkah.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, so there is an industry, we'll call it an industry of scholarship that has sort of exploded in we'll call it yeshivish scholarship, the kind of scholarship that goes on in yeshiva. And that is to come up with reasons for why is Hanukkah 8 days? Why is Hanukkah 8 days? It is a question that has been asked throughout history. It was asked maybe in the 1200s by the Meiri, but the one who seems to have really gotten the ball rolling, so inspiring people to think about this question, is Rabbi Yosef Karo. Rabbi Yosef Karo lived in the 1500s, eventually in Tzfat, and he was part of a group of scholars who just happened to be in Tzfat at the same time, and were each one in their own right just earth-shatteringly impactful on how we study Torah and approach Judaism today. And we're talking, Tzfat is just such a little town. It's just a funny town. Anyway, so he wrote amongst other things, he is the author of the Shulchan Aruch, the Rabbi Yosef Karo. He wrote commentary on the Rambam. He wrote a commentary on the Tur, the kind of predecessor to the Shulchan Aruch. He was extremely prolific, Rabbi Yosef Karo. He was there at the same time as Rabbi Isaac Luria and Moshe Cordovera, and he was there at the same time, and Chaim Vital, and he was also at the same time as the Alshich, commentary right there in the middle over there. No, where's the Alshich? The Alshich somewhere, might be up over there somewhere. Anyways, so who was a very impactful commentary on the Torah. Anyway, so Rabbi Yosef Karo sort of kicked the ball rolling by asking, why is it 8 days? After all, according to the Talmud, the story is that there wasn't enough oil to last, but there certainly was enough oil to last the first day. So the miracle should have really been considered 7 days, not 8 days. So it spawned a kind of industry of discussion about this subject, to the point where there was a book at one point that has 100 answers to that question, 100 different answers to that question. I have a nephew who told me last week that he believes there's at least 500 of these answers out there somewhere. So much of the energy and effort that people expend during this time in the yeshiva community is on that subject. So this year, for some reason, more than other years, it struck me that it's sort of funny that when they ask this question, they don't give the obvious answer. Right, because here's the thing about the oral law, or let's call it Tanakh and the oral law. If you lived in, let's say you had a Jewish household at around the year 1 of the Common Era. Let's say it's the year 1 of the Common Era. You live anywhere in the Jewish world, and you have a house with a library. So in your library, you would have, as far as your Jewish library, your Jewish texts, you would have Tanakh. So Tanakh is the 5 books of what we call Chumash, or the Torah, 5 books of Torah, or 5 books of Moshe. Then you would have Nevi'im, which is the book of Joshua, the book of Judges, the book of Shmuel, Samuel, the book of Kings, and then the books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Yechezkel, Ezekiel, and then the 12 books, which are sometimes called minor prophets. They're really just minor books. That would be the Nevi'im section. And then you'd have the Ketuvim section. The Ketuvim section would have things like Psalms and Proverbs and the book of Job and the 5 Megillot, like Megillas Esther and Koheles and those kind of things. You'd have Song of Songs. You'd have the book of Ezra, the book of Nehemiah, the book of Daniel, and the book of Chronicles. So that's Tanakh. That would be your Jewish book section. That would be your library. That would be it. That's all that would be written at that time. It's a lot. But then in about the year 220, there was the publication of the Mishnah. The Mishnah is now representing a kind of encyclopedia, we'll call it an encyclopedia of the oral law. Now you have Tanakh and you have Mishnah. In between Tanakh and Mishnah, there are other texts that are being produced, but they're not, for whatever reason, being included in the official canon. So again, I listed Tanakh, but there are some other books that are being written. Now, some of these books we have a record of. We recognize that they existed. In other words, when I say we, there is a continued Jewish tradition that it means the Mishnah and the Talmud, that the Talmud of the Jerusalem Talmud is being finished sometime in the 300s, and the Babylonian Talmud around 500. In these works, they reference other works that are not part of Tanakh, and they're not part of Mishnah, and they're not part of Midrash, and they're not part of the Gemara. There are some other works. For instance, there's a work called Ben Sira. Ben Sira was a work that existed early on. It seems to have, like in the year, I believe in the year 1, if you had a library, you might have had the book of Ben Sira, but it wasn't part of what we would call the Jewish canon. So you might have had the book of Ben Sira in your general section of books, but you wouldn't have had it in your Jewish section necessarily, even though it was written by a Jewish person or persons. It's a book of wisdom, but it wasn't considered canon. So it didn't become part of what is eventually known as Masorah, the tradition of text. So there were some other texts out there. David has brought up an interest in something called the Book of Enoch. So there are other texts out there that sometimes they're called gospels or something. There's one called Judith, and there's one called what was it? It was used by this teacher of Talmud. He used it. And, anyways, there were quite a few other works. They are under the general category of apocrypha. Apocrypha means a text that wasn't included in the canon. It's outside the canon. So there were certain other ones that existed outside the canon. Some of them fared better than others. Like Ben Sira is quoted in the Talmud. It gets quoted in the Talmud. Even Josephus, who's writing, like maybe 100 years, whatever, he's writing in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s or the 90s of the first century there. Even Josephus is quoted by other commentaries. But there are some works that just, we don't know anything about. Clementine or some, was it Clementine? Well, no, Susanna. Why did I say? Because they're both those old songs. Oh, Susanna, and my darling Clementine. So there's one called the Book of Susanna or something. So these, apparently they have texts of these. Somebody was preserving them. But we don't have a preserved text. And some of them may have originally, most likely were originally written in Hebrew, but nobody has the original Hebrew text of some of these. So the first text you have is a translation into Greek or Aramaic, and then a translation into either Hebrew from that or English from that, and then, etc. So one of these Apocrypha, Book of Apocrypha, that existed early on was called the Book of Maccabees. There are actually two books of Maccabees. They don't seem to have been together originally. They seem to be two separate works. And again, I am not a scholar of these kind of early texts. I don't know how many people think what about them, but I know they're very early, and they're known to have been sometime, before the Common Era, possibly written right after the Hanukkah story. Maybe I don't know what the evidence is, but they're very early. They're very early. There's a book called the Book of Maccabees. So I'm just going to quote. This is from the second book of Maccabees, which I read somewhere, might even be earlier than the first book of Maccabees. And it says, they celebrated it for 8 days this is talking about Hanukkah. They celebrated it for 8 days with rejoicing in the manner of the Festival of Booths, remembering how not long before, during the Festival of Booths, they had been wandering in the mountains and caves like wild animals. Now, this translation, again, this was Greek then. This translation is the Catholic, the revised standard version, Catholic edition, because the Catholics have this in their canon. They preserve the Book of Maccabees in their canon. So all right, so let's just see here. It happened on the same day of which the sanctuary had been profaned by the foreigner. So apparently what had happened was this. The Assyrian Greeks, when they profaned the temple, they picked a date. They didn't just run in and profane it. They had a particular date they wanted to do it on, and that was the 25th of Kislev. They wanted to do it on 25th of Kislev. There are different theories as to why. It could be it was an ancient pagan festival called Saturnalia, which celebrated the beginning of light. In other words, after the shortest days, then now there's light coming up. It's possible it was because of Saturnalia. It's possible because they knew that the temple, that Ezra's temple that had been dedicated maybe 200 years before Hanukkah had itself been dedicated on the 25th of Kislev. That's possible. Let's see here. Somebody's trying to get in. So, but for whatever reason, the Gentiles at the time, which we'll call the Assyrian Greeks, they chose that date to profane the temple. Profaning the temple meant putting in idols, sacrificing pigs, just completely sort of undoing the kind of sacred nature of the temple. So they picked the 25th of Kislev. So according to this text in the second book of Maccabees, not rabbis, whoever they were, the Hashmonaim, waited until the 25th of Kislev in order to rededicate the temple, because they wanted to do it. They wanted to sort of undo the profanity that was done. Okay. So how much earlier could it have been done? Unclear, but it may have been a matter of a couple of days or something, but that's what they chose to do. So it happened that on the same day on which the sanctuary had been profaned by the foreigners, the purification of the sanctuary took place. That is, on the 25th day of the same month, which is Kislev, that month of Kislev. They celebrated it for 8 days with rejoicing in the manner of the festival of booths, which is Sukkot, remembering how not long before, during the festival of booths, they had been wandering in the mountains and caves like wild animals. Therefore, carrying ivy-wreathed wands and beautiful branches and also fronds of palm, they offered hymn of thanksgiving to him who had given success to the purifying of his own holy place. They decreed by public edict, ratified by vote, and the whole nation of the Jews should observe these days every year. Since then was the end of Antiochus, who was called Epiphanes. So this is, again, in the book of Maccabees, the second book of Maccabees, which is Apocrypha and is not part of our Masorah. But it seems to be suggesting that just like Sukkot is 8 days, they decided to have an 8-day festival, and sort of in a way rectifying the fact that the Sukkot that they had just a couple months prior was less than celebratory. You know, they're hiding in caves and running around in the middle of a fight. So now they want to do it right, do it upright. So it's something like that. So they have, now this explanation is mentioned, but as one of the possible explanations for why it's 8 days, but it's only mentioned as one of the possible explanations. And it's not mentioned by Rabbi Yosef Karo when he asked the question, why is Hanukkah 8 days? It's not, as far as I know, it's because it's always quoted in the name of the Aruch HaShulchan, who was a Rabbi Epstein, who wrote this classic halachic work, like at the beginning of the 1900s. So that's many hundreds of years since Rabbi Yosef Karo asked the question, and Rabbi Yosef Karo wasn't the first person to ask the question. Now, all right, so you have, as far as early traditions go, you have this text, which I've, in talking with like my friend Rabbi Becher, he suggests that this text is quoted by scholars over the years. So it was a known text. It was part of the Catholic canon. So in other words, it's out there. People had preserved this text, but it's not in, it wouldn't have been on your Jewish bookshelf, but it was still out there. People knew about it, and it talked about it, and it gave this explanation. So you could say, why? So the question is, why isn't it mentioned? I was suggesting to Rabbi Becher, maybe it isn't mentioned because since it isn't part of the tradition, they don't want to give it credence at all. But he said, but they do, it is mentioned every once, the text itself is quoted every once in a while. So it'd be funny if they're saying, we don't want to give it credence, except for here, when we're going to quote it here, except for this, where we quote it over here. So, and you'd have to think that people with access to as many books as people like Rabbi Yosef Karo and others had, they would have had it. But maybe that he's saying something like, even though I know it's out there, I'm just not going to give it any credence because it's not part of our tradition. We don't even have the original Hebrew to it. We don't know how we don't know the identity of the people who put it together. We don't know the exact Hebrew, etc. So maybe that's it, but I don't know. He wasn't as convinced that would be it, right? But it's just weird that there you have all these people asking for it, and there's an explanation given from a very early text,
But nobody wants
and then it's finally mentioned, by somebody as one of 500 answers to the question, why is Hanukkah 8 days? Because of this thing, and that it wouldn't get a more prominent mention to it from before. So I mentioned to you that if you had a Jewish library, you would have had Tanakh. Let's say in the year 1 of the Common Era, you would have had Tanakh. And then you would have had to wait till about 220, and then you would have had Mishnah, and then 350, then you would have added the Jerusalem Talmud, then 500, you would have had the Babylonian Talmud, you would have had a few collections of Midrash already on your bookcase. There is something else that you could have had in the year 1, which is something called Megillus Tainus, the scroll of fast. It's not really a scroll of fast, it's the scroll of days where you're not supposed to fast.
Mm.
So this was a scroll of all sorts of holidays that had come to be celebrated throughout the Jewish world, because if there was some kind of miracle, a salvation, some kind of day where your community, city, state was very grateful, you could establish a holiday, a kind of local holiday. And that local holiday would have the characteristic, it would be a time to celebrate. And it would also be, you could say it's a time where we're not going to do eulogies, we're not going to fast. And instead, we're going to have celebration. They might even say Hallel on these days because of some kind of particular salvation that happened. So this Megillus Tainus was a collection of those days. One of those days, or one of those holidays that's in Megillus Tainus is Hanukkah. And so that existed by the year 1. That is, almost everybody believes that by the year 1 that existed. So, and it might have been one of the, besides Tanakh, one of the earliest texts that we have. In that text, we do have that preserved. First of all, there are people that have editions of the whole thing, but we have it preserved in the Talmud. There is no tractate about Hanukkah in the Talmud, even though the Babylonian Talmud is only put together in the year 500, which is 600 years after Hanukkah. There's no separate tractate for Hanukkah. There is a separate tractate for Rosh Hashanah. There's a separate tractate for Sukkot. There's not a separate tractate for Shavuos, the holiday of Shavuos. There is a separate tractate for Yom Kippur. There is, and there's a separate tractate for Purim, which is called Megillah. But there is no so the two holidays that don't have their own tractate that are either biblical or considered major rabbinic holidays are Shavuos and Hanukkah. Hanukkah gets a mention in Tractate of Shabbos. So in the Tractate of Shabbos, it quotes from that scroll of Ta'anit. And that's where it gives the explanation about the oil. That that the oil was lit for 8 days. The oil lasted for 8 days. It was only supposed to be one thing of oil, and it lasted for 8 days. So you have, again, by the year 100, you have Josephus describing what happened in Hanukkah. You would have the scroll of Tainus talking about what happened in Hanukkah, and you would have the book of Maccabees talking about it. So I remember one time, and I've shared this on several occasions, one time I was ranting to Rav Moshe Shapiro, blessed memory, that why is it that the sages from those times did not insist on there being a competing history to Josephus's. Once Josephus wrote his history, why didn't they decide that somebody else has to write a history to compete with it? So he goes, what's wrong with Josephus's, with Josephus? So I said, first of all, he was like a Benedict Arnold. I didn't say Benedict Arnold because this conversation was happening in Hebrew with an Israeli, but he was a traitor. He was a Jewish general who gave up and went to the side of the Romans. He didn't fight with the Romans, but he became like eventually a Roman citizen and a historian, and he was writing his histories for Romans. So he's a traitor. And the second thing was, when he wrote things like about Hanukkah, he doesn't mention the oil, the miracle with the oil. So he said, if you were there, you also wouldn't have mentioned the miracle of the oil. Right. So, and what did he mean? What he meant was that imagine you lived at that time and your group of ragged soldiers had defeated the Assyrian Greeks armies, who are not the Greeks under Alexander, but they are still very well trained, very big army. The exaltation, the joy, the sense of celebration and relief that you would have been experiencing would have been incredulous. Imagine you see pictures of Argentinians celebrating the World Cup, like in let's say in Chicago when the Cubs or the White Sox won the World Series. They plan it for like 3 days, and then 3 days later everybody comes out. In Argentina, I think it was like 1 minute later there were 1 million people out celebrating this thing, and they're exulting, and they're so you can imagine the joy of it. And this is your life. This isn't a football game. This is your life, that you were persecuted, and so ragtag group of people decide they're going to do guerrilla war against this incredible army, and then you're victorious. The experience of that. Do you remember the Entebbe? Hearing about Entebbe, because we only hear about it after it happened. The kind of joy that it was. I remember it was like the 4th of July. I remember I was up in northern Wisconsin at my mother's like summer place in northern Wisconsin and reading about that. And it was just like, what? Are you kidding me? And the feeling after the 6-day war, that feeling after the 6-day war continues to reverberate. And especially right afterwards, the feeling that it was this just incredible miracle. So imagine you lived at that time, and then somebody told you, hey, by the way, you're never going to believe what happened, but in the Beit HaMikdash, there was enough oil to last just 1 day, and it lasted 8 days. It would be on page 30. It may not even make it in the newspaper. It might have to be like in, the Inquirer, because it wouldn't even make it into regular, because it's one of those things, like it's what I would call a grade C miracle. It's the kind of thing where if you experienced it, you're going, wow, is that incredible? And you tell everybody you can't believe this. You have to come and see this, because this is just absolutely incredible. But it's not matching up to the war. That is not happening. Right. So now I'm just suggesting my experience when I see these various things, the text in Maccabees, the discussion about the wars in Josephus and in Maccabees and in other places, because we talk about the war even in our prayers and in Al Hanisim. But you just can imagine, just from our limited experiences, what that would have been. So it seems like what was happening was this: something absolutely incredible happened. And then to the point where they decided they're going to make a holiday for this, right? But what is the message of who's in charge of the message is essentially what's going to happen next. Who's in charge of the message? So the tradition, what we'll call the Masorah, which ends up being decided by the Mishnah and the Gemara and etc., and what follows afterwards, they decided that that miracle that happened in the Beit HaMikdash, while not being the primary reason for the exaltation, is how we are going to frame the lesson. This is how we're going to frame the lesson. And this is, it used to be the sort of prerogative of prophets, but there were no more prophets. So now it becomes the sort of role of the rabbis, the Sanhedrin and the rabbis, the people that follow afterwards. They are going to decide on the message. What are we to learn from this time? Some of it is, it may take a year or two to get. They don't mention it here yet. I don't know the difference, how quickly that Megillus Tinus comes out compared to the Book of Maccabees. They could be coming out around the same time. I don't know. But already in that scroll, they're already focused on the lights, on the miracle of the lights already over there. So it's happening early. Exactly, how early did it happen? We were at the museum. It's called the Living Torah Museum in Brooklyn, where this guy has collected a lot of fantastic original items from biblical times all the way through Talmudic times. And he has a menorah with a kind of letter from, I don't know if it's the Weizmann Institute or somebody, who verified that this menorah is from like 80 years after the Hanukkah wars. Okay, so 80 years after, there's already an 8-candle menorah. So it's not that long afterwards that's how the celebration's happening. Was it 1 year after? Was it 20 years after? But at some point, the decision was made. This is how we are going to understand this. We're not just going to understand it as a celebration of an impossible military victory, which already on its own could deserve Hallel, and it could deserve all sorts of celebration, because being saved by God in a miraculous way is already worthy of a holiday. But that's not just what we're going to focus on. And they chose to focus on the fact that light dispelled darkness, that the pure dispelled the impure, that it was a victory over purity over impurity, light over darkness. Now, it happens to be at a time when the pagans are celebrating a light and darkness holiday like Saturnalia, and it's happening at a time. So the issues of light and darkness are being confronted by the entire world. That's why they have pagan festivals, because they are celebrating stuff that all people are confronting. They're just, doing it in their own way. And so this also addresses that. In other words, this addresses light and darkness, but again, from a particular perspective. The perspective is that there is a darkness in the world. And that darkness is attempts to put out the light of Torah and the light of Judaism. The most recent experience the Jews had with the Assyrian Greeks was of persecution, where they forbade the study of Torah. They forbade the keeping of mitzvahs. That's very much in the book of Maccabees, besides in other texts as well. But that was very much in here, that they forbade, couldn't do circumcision. There were all sorts of things that were part of prohibitions against the Jews. So there was, in a sense, an attempt to put out the light of Judaism. It wasn't simply subjugation, physical subjugation. It wasn't simply taxing. It wasn't even simply trying to wipe out the Jews physically. It wasn't that, but it was experienced as an attempt to put out the light of Judaism. And that you couldn't put it out. One little light. It starts with one little light, and then it moves, and you can't put it out. That was the choice that was made at that time for the interpretation of the events that happened. So it's not that they are not acknowledging the military victory. The military victory is acknowledged. It's not that they're not even, I'm suggesting, even the Aruch HaShulchan, when he brings this, he says that they saw the miracle of the candles as referencing this. In other words, speaking to this victory. And therefore, they've decided to use the miracle of the lights as the window into the deep meaning, as they saw it, of what happened. That at this time, and then it becomes broadened, because even though our specific beef was with the Assyrian Greeks, but Greece in general represented a threat to Judaism, in that it threatened to supplant Judaism. They had their own philosophies, sciences, art, and all sorts of discussions about the questions that people have about the universe, and all sorts of potential answers or directions on how to answer it. So that itself, even before the persecutions and even before the military battles, Greece itself represented a kind of threat to what you would call the light of Torah. So it gets expanded and expanded. But that's once a decision is made that this holiday is about something more than just a military victory, and that this thing that was happening in the Beit HaMikdash, which again, if it happened, like Ramosha Shapiro said to me, you would not have recorded it. That's how little it would have seemed to you at the time. You would not have even mentioned it. Or if you did, you would have mentioned it. The fact that Josephus doesn't mention it is not it's not an indictment on Josephus. He's saying you also wouldn't have mentioned it when you're thinking about it. This is something that is sort of reserved for the particular insight of people at that time who are kind of managing how we understand events in the world and are trying to put things in perspective. And that was part of the responsibility originally of prophets, and then of rabbinic figures. And part of the purpose of the tradition was that we lived through history, but we also have a kind of take on history. But when you say we have a take on history, it's what we mean is our tradition has a take on history from a particular perspective. So now when you see people working on Hanukkah, they're working on deep mystical lessons about Hanukkah, deep mystical lessons about the light of the menorah and the Beis HaMikdash, and the light of the Chanukiah, and what it means to say light dispels darkness, and the terms. Even the 25th word of the Torah is or. And the kind of things where you're plumbing the depths of discussions of light and darkness, that's all because at some point there were teachers who felt that this is the great lesson that happens. Maybe 100 years later, from when I was talking about with the, year one. About 100 years later, maybe 120 years later, there was a decision made that we're no longer going to follow the dictates in the scroll of Tainus, in Megillus Tainus. So all these holidays that people have been giving are no longer going to be holidays, which would have meant that Hanukkah would no longer be celebrated because Hanukkah was in that scroll. That was in that scroll. So there were scholars, amongst them Rabbi Yoshua, who this would have been just like 100 years later. Rabbi Yoshua was one of them who went around and says, no, Hanukkah we're keeping. All the other ones we're not doing, but Hanukkah we're keeping. And he actually traveled around Israel and demonstrated to people that he's keeping Hanukkah and we're keeping Hanukkah, that Hanukkah is not going by the wayside. And again, the other holidays did. Because again, you see, like who's Rabbi Akiva's, one of Rabbi Akiva's primary teachers and others, he felt that these lessons, in other words, the lesson from the oil and the bigger kind of spiritual lessons from Hanukkah, that we could not afford to lose those from our experience. So it's eventually being preserved primarily, it seems, for that lesson. The war, the victory, etc. There were other, maybe not anything at the magnitude of Hanukkah, but there were other miraculous victories and things that caused holidays to come into being at those times. But they're gonna sort of be a slate. The slate's going to be cleaned of those, but not Hanukkah. Hanukkah is going to continue to be celebrated. Okay, that's that. Have a wonderful Hanukkah.
Thank
Nice
you.
to get together again. I'm thinking next week. It's a good time.
Good night.
Be well. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye-bye, guys. Bye-bye. Great to see you.
By the
Bye-bye.
feet of snow.